Okay, today's topic for the podcast is going to be on Democide over the 20th century. We're not going to go before with it because when you go before that, sometimes the numbers get a little bit hazy. We're not going to go since then because we don't have a full century to go over. But we're going to go with this and topic because it's a very important topic because what this will discuss with it is the impacts. Really, what most of it's over is the ideas of Marxism and what Marxism really did to people, and what the idea of an authoritarian regime as what Marxism and what some of the other authoritarian regimes did to their own people. As what democide really is basically when a government kills its own people. It's not when it's not just does not consider the ideas of war and other aspects. It actually considers just the idea of when one government kills its own people, not through the ideas of execution for actual crimes, but for the sake of actually trying to exert its own force. And we'll go over the actual numbers and why it actually matters. Now, first, I'd like to ask people to consider donating to my Patreon page. It's patreon.com/challengehistory. I'll put the information in the bottom of my this post when it gets posted on YouTube. It goes from base of $1, $10 is the next level, $25, and when you get to the $50 and $100 levels, 50 will have a eventual when we reach a potential amount of enough people donating, it will be for a Roman gold coin giveaway, and $100 will be for a giveaway of a gold Byzantine coin. Or so the $50 is a silver Roman coin. Sorry, not gold Roman coin, but silver Roman coin, and the $100 is a gold Byzantine coin. And those are from those empire times. So it's not just like a new coin that looks like those eras. Those are from those times with it, which does make it actually kind of something special. And when we get down to the top, when we get, if you read the thing, you'll see kind of that I am on disability. The money goes to help me with medical stuff with it, my disability. It also goes to help with the podcast as well for equipment. Currently, I'm using pretty basic equipment with it, and I could obviously use an upgrade with it. And if I ever need any upgrades for stuff like computers and stuff like that, it would go toward that as well. And as since I'm not at the level of earning advertisements, I don't really have the way of earning that to pay for new equipment, and this would be a way for me to essentially be able to earn that. There's also kind of introductory email, introductory notice here with it. I did February 23rd, and you'll basically see all that stuff right there. Now onto this with it is comes out of University of Hawaii. That they were able to post up the numbers with it. They got numbers totaling about 262 million people. Now, when we look at that, we can actually average that out at about approximately about 2.62 million people per year killed by democide. And this is going through all of the numbers. With it, you would actually see that that's actually quite a bit of people just from democide. That's actually just killing your own people. And that's just through this whole period with it of what people were murdered with it. And most of these, you'll notice that that it's actually just an action of the actual people that were from either from most of them were Marxist systems. Now there were a couple of things in there were a couple of cases in which weren't, which we can say that Pakistan wasn't. Pakistan wasn't. It was more of a. That's more under a religious thing. That was about 1.5 million people. There were some other ones that ended up being about just short of 11 million people. Indonesia, about 700,000, was most likely not, though that's mainly religious. Portugal was under a dictatorship. That was about 741,000. The UK, about 816,000. So that wasn't necessarily. Turkey is on here a couple of times. One for about 878,000. Ataturk, that was from 1919 to 1923. The Chinese warlords, 1910. That was not at a time where we were talking. That's 1917, 910,000. That's 1917 to 1949. That was not at the point of where we were talking about them being actually communist at that time. It was the PRC, which we believe as communists, as you'll see where they were about 76,702,000 people. Other ones you'll notice is Mexico at about 1,417,000 is on there. Was not part of that. Pakistan again from 58 to 87, about 1.503 million. Let's see. Turkey from 1909 to 1918, that was 1.883. That was actually part of the Ottoman Empire. China under the Mao Soviets, that's 23 to 48. That's that would be from it. But Japan under Japan from 36 to 45, 5.964 million. Then we have like China. Then your next one would be colonialism, which ended up killing people as well. That's about 50 million. And then the rest of the numbers out there would be approximately all from the effects of actually Marxism, which would be well over 200 million. So basically we're talking well over 80% of those numbers. And the problem being when we're talking about Marxism is there's a lot of time they secrecy to these things. And the problem being is the way they actually judge these things is you'd have to find the bodies. And that's where a lot of times that the way they actually figure these things is by trying to find the bodies. Well, sometimes it becomes very, very difficult because there's a lot of secrecy with these whole things, and they don't want to actually give out exact numbers. Unless you find the bodies, you can't get an exact number because of these factors. And sometimes the bodies are going to be incinerated, and that's the whole thing. Now, there was a lot more numbers because we know a little bit more of the history of like the National Socialists of Germany. So we know a little bit more of their numbers to be a little closer to being accurate. That would be of the just short of 21 million. But when it comes down to like the Soviets numbers and some of the Chinese numbers, we don't know a lot of their numbers to be that accurate. If you total a lot of the numbers within China, it ends up being closer when they've been under all of their forms of their versions of Marxism. It ends up being closer to the number of about 100 million people. They end up taking about half of those numbers, or that are actually taken up by socialism. And that's something that's actually that actually a lot of people don't realize, is when people try to say, well, Hitler's bad with it. Well, Hitler did it, yes, within about a 13-year span. But if we start to take that with what's which was actually a lot faster than some did compared to others. But if you compare the actual body amount in what Mao did, Mao and some people still after Mao did, which it ended up kind of ceasing up until about 87, which is when Democide really kind of ceased at that point, because it would essentially gather a lot of people to get a lot of countries to potentially invade to stop these wars, whether right or wrong, to intervene. It would collectively gather a lot of people. Now, when we're talking about that, this is why when we came to about 87, it would essentially stop. And that's why if you look at some of these numbers, you'll see that's where it kind of ceased. And also we have, with some of the numbers, we need to understand that sometimes country size and where they're located can sometimes distort the amount, and it can sometimes be percentage-wise, such as Cambodia over a 5-year period killed over 2 million people. Well, Cambodia is not that large of a country, so 2 million people was actually such a huge percentage of the population. And that needs, with what Pol Pot did, and that was much more of a large impact than what Germany had ever done. And yet, he is much less of a known figure out in the world than what Hitler is. Because when people try to use these insults of, basically when they try to use insults of people trying to end a conversation and try to insult people on their political ideologies, and try to say that because they believe that Hitler was conservative when he was actually a far statist left-wing liberal. They try to basically they'll try to state any conservative is is they'll say just like Hitler. Well, the fact is they use this without actually understanding any of it. Number one. Number two is there was actually much worse than Hitler out there, which is actually one thing that they need to understand is per country size and per the realm of what the percentage of what damage that they did is Pol Pot was far worse. But you're not seeing people out there saying, you're literally Pol Pot. I mean, you're not seeing anybody do that because Pol Pot was potentially the worst out there. When we're talking what he did, I believe it ends up being closer to 35% of his population he wiped out. Which, if you look out the exact percentages, I mean, Hitler was nowhere near that. Hitler didn't even come close to even anywhere close to even hitting 10%. And when you hit like 35%, I mean, you're really wiping out your population. You're doing damages that could if you went any higher, he would have actually created a situation that would have made his population essentially where it would have come to a point where he would have killed off his whole country. And if he essentially would have kept ruling, he would have essentially killed off his whole country. And he essentially did this with the blessing of the people like Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger loves Pol Pot. And Henry Kissinger did and Henry Kissinger a lot of times would sign up on a lot of these leaders. And they were essentially on these lists of these insane leaders. And it's because the fact is he had some insane views himself. Because he had certain people he disliked and certain people he liked. And there was no rationale to the point of view. He would have completely different opposition views between Europe and Asia, which did not make any legitimate sense. Now, when we look at the list with it, is we should take the idea of we should not want to repeat what actually has happened. And I think it's because we know that this list could theoretically be could be 1/4 the size of what it really is, because this is really, in many cases, some of these are they're just trying to estimate. Because when we have this list this is basically just a general list of what happened with the cases of over the 1900s and what was a general idea of what was occurring. And what we have, because we need to understand, is there were countries that essentially, to this day, want to make sure that a lot of the documents are sealed, and they don't want their historical past known. And China's one of them, and the Soviet Union's another one. The Soviet Union, and in many cases, even Russia today does not know the amount, because of a lot of times they would kill people and send them out to the gulag and kill them and or let them to die, and those people were not even known. They would basically essentially disappear them from the rolls. So there would essentially be where they could not tell any difference between a person leaving and a person leaving the country and a person that was killed. And this is a problem that we're talking about these lists. So the actual numbers could be much, much higher. And we could be talking numbers that are actually far greater. And there's a lot of other countries they could easily be on this list that have numbers out there that they've done these things with it, and that maybe that a lot of these countries could be blaming on other causes. They could easily, very very simply, blame these things on natural homicide, natural death, and basically you do that to basically make it look like your country was actually better than it was. And that's the whole problem. So these numbers of about 262 million people is is basically could be a far cry from the number that we actually really had. It could have been easily closer to 1 billion, and that's not really out of the question. And because when we're talking about these are some of these countries that were just massive in murder, and it's just what ends up happening. And that's why democide is really really looked down upon, and it's not something that's really out of the question of happening again. And it's something that's very very easy. All you have to do is basically have a leader that does not believe in individual rights. And when we look at the ideas of collectivism, when we look at which comes from the statist view, which is basically people that either come from neoconservative ideologies or come from socialist ideologies, it's not very hard to realize that it's very, very easy for that to happen. And you can have that happen very, very easily. And when people out there like a Ben Shapiro are gaining lights with it, or are being considered as being respectable, or people like that, and Bill Kristol are considered respectable on one side with it, or people like the Young Turks are considered respectable for thoughts. What's going to happen is, if that's considered mainstream thoughts, guess what you're going to get? You're going to get democide again, and that's exactly what you're going to repeat. And if you try to tell people that are basically like Rand Paul, that are Thomas Massey, that you start telling those people, hey, you're a bunch of crazy nutballs, well, guess what? If you try to say those people are crazy, your outcome's going to be democide. And that's going to be the outcome of the whole world. And you're basically going to repeat the whole problems of this. And because of what we have now, where we have several groups that are essentially trying to commit democide currently, where we have the ideas of such as the Saudi government's essentially trying to support this idea of democide with the expansion of Sunni extremists around the globe, while trying to state that they're trying to fight it on the other hand, which is a complete utter lie. And and then having this fake war on drugs, this global war on drugs, and doing that, and it's just going to lead to a lot of people that are going to be thrown in prison and basically killed. And we see what happens with socialism globally with history. We see what China's done. We see what the Soviet Union's done. We've seen what the National Socialists of Germany has done. We've seen what happened in Cambodia. We've seen what happened in Vietnam. We've seen what the situation out in Poland with the National Socialists in Germany that actually took over Poland, and we saw what happened there. We've seen what happened in the Soviet Yugoslavia. We've seen what's happened in North Korea, and so on and so forth. I mean, we've seen what happened under the cases of the Ottoman Empire in Turkey. We've seen what's happened in Indonesia with the cases of basically the Islamic center there, with basically exterminating people there from 65 to 87. That's 729,000 people. We've seen other cases with people that don't want to leave power, where you have where you had basically like in the Philippines with the case of what's his name? With Marcos. Marcos didn't want to leave power, so basically he declared martial law and killed over 25,000 of his own people. And that led to the uprising from both of his from supporters of both sides. Now, his supporters continue to use explosives, including pipe bombs, to basically terrorize their own people, even up until the mid-90s. I mean, and that this should be an idea of what actually goes on when we're talking about these people. So it didn't end there when he was removed from power. And this is what ends up happening from these cases. These people have their loyal supporters, and they will exist far past when they're actually removed. And this is why you don't want to go down that road to begin with. Which is why you don't exactly want to use this the idea of essentially entering in these ideas of becoming this nation that supports Marxism, because you're just basically going to lead to killing a bunch of your people, because it ends up using the idea of force, and force ends up leading to people end up going to jail and end up being executed because they don't support the rule of the king. And it doesn't matter if you want to call it democratic or not. This is the end rule. Doesn't matter if you call it democratic socialism, national socialism. It's all the same thing. And they're always going to try and retitle it, but it's still going to be authoritarian, and these authoritarian things lead to more democide, and it's always going to lead to the same thing. And if we want to avoid this, we should obviously not go down to the same road and end up working toward more liberty and working away from this statism and collectivism format, and stop telling people that it's mainstream to support these collectivist things. I'm sorry with it, but people that support collectivism are not mainstream. That is because if you do not support the ideas of the founders of this country, I'm sorry, but that's not mainstream. That's completely against mainstream. You're essentially a complete and utter whack job and crazy person that's completely radical if you're actually supporting those ideas. You should be considered no different than some person that thinks they're the Messiah, screaming on a sidewalk in a major city. That should be the same thing that we consider people like Ben Shapiro, people like Bill Kristol, people like Bernie Sanders, people like the Young Turks, people like Kyle Kulinski, people like all of these ones out there on Secular Talk, all these people like this, those are the ones that are out there that are completely and utterly nuts. And those are the ones that will lead us down to these same instances of democide. Now, if you like this video, make sure to like, subscribe, click the notification bell, make sure that you share it all the way around to your friends and everywhere else publicly on social media. Make sure you check out my Patreon page, and if you can't donate, make sure you share with someone else who can. And I will see you guys later for my nightly live stream here on YouTube. And that's about it, everyone. Bye.